I wasn't supposed to hear that call, and if I had just walked away, my life would have stayed small, quiet, safe, but I didn't. I stood there outside his office at 11:42 p.m., a folder pressed against my chest, the hallway empty except for the low hum of the city bleeding through 40 floors of glass, and his voice, calm, precise, cutting through the door like it was meant to find me. Make sure it's handled before morning. He said, not loud, not angry, just certain, the kind of certainty that made your lungs forget how to work, and I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was just his assistant, that people like Adrian Cole lived in a different world than mine, one with rules I didn't understand and consequences I didn't want to imagine. But then he said a name, and my pen moved without thinking, scribbling it down in the margin of a report I wasn't even reading, because that's what I do, I organize. I remember, I fix things before they break, except this time, I didn't know I was the one breaking something. I stepped back when I heard his chair move, my heart beat too loud in my ears, heels silent against the polished floor as I rushed back to my desk, pretending to work, pretending I hadn't just crossed a line I couldn't see, and when he walked out minutes later, suit perfect, expression unreadable, his eyes passed over me like I was invisible, and I almost believed I was safe again, almost. Until the next morning when the news alert flashed across my phone while I stood in line for coffee, one name, one location, and a strange, hollow feeling in my chest that wouldn't go away. I told myself it was coincidence, that the world was bigger than my mistakes, but then I walked into the office and felt it, the shift, subtle but real, like the air itself had changed. People spoke softer, moved faster, avoided eye contact, and when I reached my desk, there was a note waiting for me, no signature. Just 2 words written in clean, deliberate handwriting, stay available. My fingers tightened around the paper, because Adrian Cole didn't leave notes, he didn't repeat himself, and he definitely didn't explain. I tried to focus, tried to bury myself in schedules and emails and everything that made sense, but my mind kept drifting back to last night, to the way his voice sounded when he said that name, steady, controlled, final, and I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. I wasn't scared of him before, I respected him, maybe even admired the way he ran everything like a machine that never failed, but now, sitting there with that note in my hand, I felt something else, something colder, sharper, like standing too close to the edge of a place you didn't know existed. And when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, just 3 words, no greeting, no explanation, come now. I didn't question it, I didn't ask why. I stood up, smoothed my blazer, and walked toward the private elevator like I had done 100 times before, except this time, every step felt heavier, like I was leaving something behind without realizing it, and when the doors opened to the top floor, to a space I had never been invited into, I understood, too late, that last night wasn't a mistake, it was a beginning, and whatever came next, it had already decided I was part of it. I should have turned around when the elevator doors opened, but I stepped inside anyway, because leaving would have meant admitting I was already in trouble, and I was not ready to face that yet. The ride up felt longer than it should have, each second stretching thin as the numbers climbed, my reflection staring back at me from the mirrored walls, composed on the outside, but my fingers would not stop tightening around the edge of my folder. And when the doors finally slid open, the silence hit me first, not the kind of quiet you get at night in an office, but something deeper, controlled, like even sound needed permission to exist here. The top floor was nothing like the rest of the building, no cubicles, no clutter, just clean lines, dark wood, glass that stretched from floor to ceiling, and the city laid out below like something owned, not admired. I stepped out slowly, heels echoing too loud against the marble, and that was when I saw him. Adrian Cole stood near the window, hands in his pockets, looking out over the skyline like he had built it himself. He did not turn when I approached, did not acknowledge me right away, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant he already knew I was there. You took your time, he said finally, his voice low, even, the same voice from last night, the one I could not forget. You told me to come now, I replied before I could stop myself, my voice steadier than I felt, and for a second, I thought I had said too much, but then he turned, slow, deliberate, his eyes landing on me with a kind of focus that made everything else disappear. He was not angry, not visibly, but there was something sharp behind that calm, something measuring, calculating, deciding. Do you always write down things that are not meant for you? he asked, and my breath caught because there it was, no denial, no pretending, he knew, of course he knew, men like him always knew. I tightened my grip on the folder, forcing myself to hold his gaze. I do my job, I said. Simple, safe, but his expression did not change. If anything, it grew more intent, like he was studying a problem he had not solved yet. He took a step closer, not fast, not threatening, just enough to close the distance, and suddenly the room felt smaller. Your job, he repeated, quieter now, like the words meant something different coming from him. His eyes dropped briefly to my hands, to the folder, to the pen still tucked behind my ear, then back to my face. And last night, he continued, was that part of your job too? I opened my mouth, then stopped, because there was no right answer, no version of the truth that would not change something, and he seemed to notice that hesitation, the way my thoughts stalled, the way my composure cracked just enough to be seen, and for the first time since I walked in, something shifted in his expression, not softer, not kinder, but more certain, like he had reached a conclusion. Starting today, he said, each word precise, controlled, final, you do not leave this building. Without my permission, the sentence landed heavier than it should have, simple words, but not a suggestion, not even a warning, a decision, already made. I felt my pulse spike, my instincts pushing back against it. That is not your decision to make, I said, quieter now, but firm, because I needed to say it, needed to hold on to something that felt like control. But he did not argue, did not raise his voice, he just looked at me, steady, unshaken, like my resistance had already been accounted for. It already has been, he replied, and then, almost as an afterthought, you heard something you cannot unhear, Emily. The way he said my name made it feel different, heavier, like it belonged in this room now, not out there, not in my old life, and that changes what happens next. I swallowed, my mind racing through every option, every escape, every explanation, but none of them felt real anymore, not standing here, not with him watching me like that, and for the first time, I understood something I had been avoiding since last night. This was not about work anymore. Not about schedules or meetings or anything I could organize into something manageable. This was about him deciding where I fit in his world. And the worst part was not that he had made the decision, it was that some part of me was already waiting to hear what it would be. The room did not move, but everything inside me did, shifting, recalculating, trying to find a version of reality where his words did not mean what they clearly meant, but there was no space for misunderstanding here, no room for interpretation. Adrian Cole did not speak in possibilities, only in outcomes, and I felt it settle over me like something invisible but absolute. You cannot just decide that, I said again, softer this time, not because I believed it would change anything, but because I needed to hear myself say it, needed to remind myself that I still had a voice, that I was still me, not just another piece in whatever system he controlled. His gaze did not leave mine, steady, unblinking, as if he was waiting to see how long I would hold on to that illusion. You think this is about control, he said, not as a question, but as a quiet observation, and I wanted to say yes, wanted to push back, to tell him that this was not how the world worked, not my world, but something in the way he said it stopped me, because it did not sound like a defense. It sounded like a correction. He took another step closer, close enough now that I could see the faint line of tension along his jaw, the kind that only showed when something mattered. This is about timing, he continued, his voice lower, more precise, like each word had been chosen before he spoke it. You were in the wrong place at the exact wrong moment, and now the timeline changed. The word timeline echoed in my head, clinical, detached, like my life had become a sequence of events on a chart he was already managing. I did not do anything, I said quickly, the words coming out sharper than I intended, because that mattered, it had to matter. I heard something, that is all. He nodded once, slow, acknowledging, but not agreeing. That is exactly the problem, he replied, and for the first time, there was something underneath his calm, not anger, not frustration, something closer to inevitability. Like gravity, like a rule that could not be undone. I felt my throat tighten, my thoughts scrambling for something solid to hold on to. Then tell me what happens next, I said, because if he had already decided, I needed to hear it, needed to understand the shape of whatever this was becoming. He studied me for a moment, longer this time, like he was weighing how much to say, how much I could handle, or maybe how much I deserved to know, and then he turned slightly, gesturing toward the glass wall behind him. Toward the city stretching out in endless lights. Look, he said. Simple, direct, and I hesitated, just for a second, before stepping beside him, following the line of his gaze. The streets below looked smaller from up here, distant, almost unreal, people moving like patterns instead of individuals, lives intersecting without meaning, and that was when I understood what he was trying to show me, not the view, but the distance. The separation between this world and the one I thought I lived in. Down there, he said quietly, things happen and people assume they understand why. His eyes shifted to me again, not cold, not distant, but focused in a way that made it impossible to look away. Up here, we decide why they happen. The word settled into the space between us, heavy, undeniable, and I felt something inside me shift again, not breaking, not yet, but bending, adjusting to a truth I had never been close enough to see before. And where do I fit in that? I asked, because that was the only question that mattered now, not how I got here, not what I should have done differently, just what came next. His answer came without hesitation, without doubt, like it had been waiting for me to ask. Right here, he said, and then, after a brief pause that felt longer than it was, where I can see you. I let out a slow breath I did not realize I was holding, because that was not the answer I expected. Not a role, not a task, not a punishment, just proximity. Control without force, presence without explanation, and somehow that made it more real, more permanent. I turned to face him fully, my thoughts quieter now, not because I had accepted it, but because I was starting to understand it, the structure of it, the logic behind it, even if I did not agree, and if I refuse. I asked, the question steady, even as my pulse picked up again. He did not move, did not react the way most people would when challenged. He just looked at me, calm, composed, certain. You can try, he said, not dismissive, not threatening, just factual, and something about that answer made it clear that he was not worried about the outcome, not because he underestimated me, but because he had already accounted for every possible move I could make, and for the first time since I stepped into this room, I realized that this was not a conversation about choice, it was a conversation about timing, and I was already late. There was a moment where I almost smiled, not because anything about this situation was funny, but because the clarity of it was unsettling in a way that stripped everything down to something simple, something sharp, like realizing you had been standing on the wrong side of a door your entire life and only just noticed it was locked from the outside. You planned this, I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could soften them. Because it felt true, it felt like everything that had happened since last night had been leading here. To this exact moment, to this exact conversation, and for the first time, Adrian did not immediately respond. He watched me instead, like he was deciding whether I deserved the truth or just a version of it. No, he said finally, quiet, steady, if I had planned it, you would not be surprised right now, and something about that answer settled deeper than anything else he had said. Because it removed intention and replaced it with inevitability, I looked away for a second, back to the city, to the illusion of distance and normal life, trying to anchor myself to something that felt familiar, but even that felt different now, smaller, like I had already stepped too far away from it to return the same. Then this is just bad luck, I said, almost to myself, but he heard it. Of course he did. There is no such thing as luck at this level, he replied, and I turned back to him, because that sentence meant more than it should have. Everything is a reaction, he continued, his voice calm but precise, like he was explaining something simple that I had been too far removed to understand before. You heard something, someone noticed, and now the situation adjusts. I felt a chill at that, not fear exactly, but awareness, like being pulled into a system that moved faster than I could think. Someone noticed. I repeated, because that part mattered, that part changed everything, and he gave a small nod, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just confirmation. You were not the only one paying attention last night, he said, and that was when it clicked, not fully, not in a way I could map out, but enough to know that whatever I had stumbled into did not end at him, did not stop at this building, it extended outward, into places I could not see, into decisions I could not predict. So this is about them, I said, my voice quieter now, more controlled, because understanding brought a different kind of fear, one that did not spike, but settled, and he studied me again, like he was measuring how quickly I was catching up. This is about you being visible, he corrected, and that word landed harder than anything else. Visible, not important, not powerful, just seen, you were not supposed to be, he added, almost as an afterthought, and I let out a slow breath, because that made sense in a way nothing else had. I had always been invisible in this world, efficient, reliable, unnoticed, and that was what kept me safe, but now that had changed, not because I chose it, but because I had crossed a line I did not even know existed, and staying here fixes that. I asked, because I needed to understand the logic, needed to see how this solution fit the problem. He did not hesitate. It contains it, he said, simple, direct, like it was obvious, like there was no better option, and I realized then that this was not about control in the way I had first thought, not about him wanting something from me, but about him deciding where I could exist safely within something much larger. Something I was not equipped to navigate alone. I crossed my arms without thinking, a small barrier, a small attempt to reclaim space, and what if I do not want to be contained? I asked, and this time, there was the slightest shift in his expression, not frustration, not impatience, something closer to recognition, like he had expected that question all along. Then you will be exposed, he said, and his tone did not change, did not harden, but the meaning behind it did, not a threat, not a warning, just a statement of outcome, and for a second, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, filled with everything that had already been decided, everything that had already moved into place without my permission, and I realized something else then, something I had been avoiding since the moment I stepped into that elevator. This was not a negotiation, it was an alignment, a shift in position, and whether I resisted it or not, the world I thought I understood had already adjusted around me. You are asking me to trust you, I said finally, because that was what it came down to. Not the rules, not the boundaries, just that one impossible thing, and Adrian held my gaze, steady, unwavering, like he had been waiting for me to reach that conclusion on my own. No, he said quietly, and for the first time, there was something almost human in his voice, something unguarded. I am telling you that you already have no one else to trust, and that was the moment it shifted completely, not because I agreed, not because I accepted it, but because I understood that whatever came next, it would not wait for me to decide. For a second, I said nothing, because what he had just said did not leave space for argument. It closed something instead, something I had been holding on to without realizing it, the idea that I still had options, real ones, but standing there, in that room, with the city stretched out below us and his eyes locked on mine, I understood that my choices had already narrowed without my consent. Then explain it to me, I said finally, quieter now, not as a challenge, but because I needed something solid, something I could hold on to besides the feeling that everything was slipping out of my control. And he did not hesitate this time, did not deflect or redirect. He moved past me toward a sleek table near the center of the room, tapping once on a tablet resting there, the screen lighting up with a soft glow that felt too calm for what followed. Come here, he said, not sharply, not forcefully, just enough to make it clear that this was not optional, and I stepped closer, slower than before, my attention drawn to the screen, lines of data, names, timestamps, things that looked like they belonged in a system far more complex than anything I had ever touched. This is what you interrupted, he said, and I felt my stomach tighten, not because I understood it all, but because I did not, because there were layers here I could not read, patterns I could not recognize, and yet I knew they mattered. That call you heard, he continued, his voice steady, controlled, was one part of a sequence that depends on precision. His finger moved across the screen, highlighting a section I barely processed. When something unexpected happens, the sequence adjusts, but not cleanly. I swallowed, trying to follow, trying to keep up, and I am the unexpected thing, I said, more to confirm than to ask, and he nodded once, confirming it without hesitation. Yes, he said simply, and there was no judgment in it, no blame, just fact, which somehow made it heavier. I crossed my arms again, grounding myself. So what? I stay here until it resets? I asked, because that sounded temporary, manageable, something I could survive, but his expression did not shift, did not soften, and that was my answer before he even spoke. This does not reset, he said, and the finality in his voice settled into my chest like something permanent. It evolves. I let out a slow breath, because that word meant change, meant that whatever I thought this was, it was already becoming something else, something I could not predict, and me being here helps that. I asked, my voice steadier now, because understanding, even partial, was better than confusion. It keeps you within a controlled variable, he replied, and I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because of how clinical it sounded, like I had been reduced to something measurable, something contained within a system I had never chosen to enter. I am not a variable, I said, and this time, there was a slight pause, just enough to register, before he answered, right now, you are. He said, not cruelly, not dismissively, just honestly, and that honesty hit harder than anything else, because it left no room for illusion. I looked down at the screen again, at the lines and names and patterns that suddenly felt like they had edges, like they could reach out and pull me deeper if I stayed too long, and if I walk out. I asked, even though I already knew the answer, even though he had already told me what happened if I stepped outside of what he defined as safe. Then you become visible in a system that does not account for your safety, he said, and there it was again, not a threat, not a warning, just consequence. I closed my eyes for a second, just one, letting everything settle, the room, the city, his voice. The realization that this was not something I could fix with a schedule or a plan, this was something I had to survive, adapt to, understand on its terms, not mine, and when I opened them again, I felt different, not calmer, not accepting, but clearer, like the panic had burned off and left something sharper behind. So what happens now? I asked. Because that was the only question left that mattered, and Adrian did not look at the screen this time, did not gesture or explain. He looked at me, directly, fully, like I was no longer something he was managing, but something he was placing. Now, he said, his voice lower, more deliberate than before, you stay where I can protect what you have become, and the way he said it made something in my chest tighten, not because I agreed, but because for the first time, I realized he was not just controlling the situation, he was already adjusting around me, and that meant one thing I had not been ready to face. I was no longer outside of his world, I was inside it, and there was no clear way back out. It should have felt like a cage, but it did not exactly. It felt more like standing in the middle of a room where every door had quietly locked behind you while you were still deciding which one to take, and the worst part was not the lack of exit, it was the realization that you had not even noticed when it happened. I looked at him, really looked this time, not as my employer, not as the man whose calendar I managed and whose meetings I arranged down to the minute, but as the person who had just redrawn the boundaries of my life without raising his voice, without asking for permission, and something in me resisted that, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. You keep saying protect, I said, the word slower now, more deliberate, like I was testing it, but you are also deciding everything. He did not interrupt, did not correct me right away, which somehow made it easier to keep going. Where I go, what I do, who I see, that is not protection, that is control. The sentence hung there between us, clear, unpolished, and for a second, I wondered if I had pushed too far, but Adrian did not react the way most people would. There was no irritation, no defensiveness, just that same steady focus, like he was evaluating the truth in what I said instead of rejecting it. It is both, he answered finally, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard. Control is how protection works when the risk is not negotiable. I felt that settle somewhere deeper than I wanted it to, because it made sense in a way that was difficult to argue with, even if I did not like it. I turned away from him again, pacing a few steps across the polished floor, needing movement, needing something to break the stillness of the conversation. You are asking me to trust a system I do not understand, I said, more to the room than to him, but I knew he was listening. He always listened. Even when he did not respond right away. No, he said again. Behind me, and I stopped, because that word had started to mean something different coming from him. I turned back slowly, meeting his gaze, waiting. I am telling you to stay inside it long enough to understand it, he continued, and there was something new in his tone now, not softer, but more direct, like he had shifted from explaining to instructing, and that should have made me pull back, should have made me push harder against it. But instead, it made something in me focus, sharpen, like my instincts were adjusting to a different kind of logic. And if I never do? I asked, because that mattered, because there had to be a version of this where I did not adapt, where I did not become whatever this situation was shaping me into. He watched me for a moment, longer than before, and I could see it then, the calculation, not cold, not distant, but deliberate, like he was deciding how much truth to give me again. Then you rely on me, he said, and there it was, not hidden, not softened. Exactly what this had been building toward, and my breath caught, just slightly, because that was the part one had been avoiding, the dependency, the shift from independence to something else, something that tied my safety to him in a way I could not control. That is not something I agree to, I said, quieter now, not because I was uncertain, but because I was aware of what I was pushing against, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something in his expression, not frustration, not impatience, something closer to understanding, like he had expected that answer from the beginning. You do not have to agree to it, he replied, and his voice dropped just slightly, enough to change the weight of the words. You just have to survive it. The room went still again after that, heavier than before, because that sentence did not leave room for negotiation, did not offer an alternative. It simply placed me inside a reality that had already been decided, and I felt it then, not fear, not panic, but something sharper, something that cut through everything else, clarity. I was not being asked to stay. I was being kept within reach of something that had already noticed me. And whether I liked it or not, Adrian Cole was the only person who seemed to understand exactly how far that reach extended. I drew in a slow breath, steadying myself, not because I accepted it, but because I needed to think, needed to move forward instead of standing still in a moment that was already passing. Then start explaining, I said, meeting his gaze again, more grounded now, more deliberate, because if I am staying, I am not staying blind. And something in his eyes shifted at that. Not dramatically, but enough to tell me I had just crossed into something different, not outside his control, but no longer entirely passive within it, and for the first time since this began, it felt like I was not just reacting to his world, I was stepping into it with my eyes open. Something in the room shifted when I said that, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I felt it, the subtle change in how he looked at me, like I had moved from being managed to being measured differently, not safer, not freer, but more intentional. Adrian did not respond right away, and that silence did not feel like hesitation, it felt like recalibration. Like he was adjusting something internal before deciding what came next, and then he nodded once, small, controlled, but definitive. Good, he said, and the word caught me off guard because it was not approval, not exactly, but it was not dismissal either, it was acknowledgement, and that meant something had changed. He moved back toward the table, tapping the screen again, but this time he turned it slightly so I could see it more clearly, not just fragments, not just glimpses, but enough to start forming patterns. You are going to see things that do not make sense at first, he said, his tone shifting slightly, less distant now, more instructive, like he had accepted that I was not leaving and was adjusting accordingly. Do not try to interpret them the way you normally would. I stepped closer, my attention pulled in despite everything, despite the tension still sitting tight in my chest, because this was the part one had asked for, the part where I was no longer completely in the dark. Names moved across the screen. Not randomly, but in sequences, connected by timestamps and locations, subtle links that only became visible when you stopped looking for obvious connections. These are not just people, he continued, they are positions. I frowned slightly, leaning in just enough to follow his movement as he traced a line across the display. Positions. I repeated, because that was not how I understood people, not how I organized anything, but he nodded, already expecting the confusion. Roles within a structure, he clarified, replaceable, interchangeable, but necessary. I felt something tighten at that, because it stripped away individuality, reduced everything to function, and I wondered, briefly, where I fit into that definition now. Whether I was still Emily Carter or just another variable he had inserted into this system. And last night? I asked, my voice quieter now, more focused, because this was the part that mattered. The moment everything changed, his gaze shifted to me briefly before returning to the screen. Last night disrupted a position, he said, and when that happens, everything connected to it becomes unstable. I followed the line he indicated, seeing how one change rippled outward, subtle, but undeniable, like a chain reaction that did not explode, but expanded, and I realized then that my presence had not just affected one moment, it had shifted something ongoing, something that had been moving long before I ever stepped into that hallway. So I am part of that instability now, I said, not as a question, but as a realization. And this time, he looked at me directly, his expression steady, but there was something else there now, something closer to confirmation than observation. Yes, he said, simple, direct, and I let out a slow breath, because hearing it spoken made it real in a way nothing else had. I was not just involved, I was integrated, whether I wanted to be or not, and keeping me here stabilizes it. I asked, because that was the logic he had been building toward, the reason behind everything he had decided without me. It isolates the variable, he corrected, and I almost smiled again at that, because of course he would phrase it that way, clinical, precise, controlled, but the meaning was the same, keep me where he could see me, where he could account for me, where I could not unintentionally shift anything else. I crossed my arms again, but this time it felt different, less defensive. More grounded, like I was holding my place instead of trying to protect it. And what do I do while I am being isolated? I asked, because staying was one thing, existing within this system without purpose was another, and Adrian did not hesitate this time, his answer immediate, certain, you observe, he said, and then, after a brief pause that felt deliberate, and you learn. I held his gaze, steady now, not because I was unafraid, but because I understood that fear would not change anything here, from you. I asked, and there was the faintest shift in his expression again, something subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to register, from the structure. He replied, but the way he said it made it clear that he was part of that structure, inseparable from it, and for the first time since this began, I felt something else alongside the tension and the uncertainty, something quieter, but just as strong, curiosity, not naive, not reckless, but sharp, controlled, because if I was going to stay inside this world, even temporarily, I needed to understand it on its terms, not mine, and as I looked back at the screen, at the patterns I was only beginning to see, I realized something that shifted everything again. This was not just about surviving anymore, it was about understanding something I had never been meant to see, and that meant I was already deeper in than I thought. The word learn stayed with me longer than it should have, echoing in a space that still felt unfamiliar, like I had stepped into a role without a script, and the only way forward was to pay attention. I shifted my focus back to the screen, forcing myself to slow down, to stop reacting and start observing the way he had said, because if I missed something now, it would not just be a mistake, it would be another ripple I could not control. Show me where it changed, I said, my voice steadier than before, and this time, Adrian did not question it, did not test me. He simply adjusted the display, isolating a sequence that looked no different at first glance, but then I saw it, a gap, small, almost invisible, but enough to break the pattern. Here, he said, his finger hovering just above the screen, not touching it, like even that contact mattered. This position was supposed to transition cleanly. I leaned in slightly, narrowing my focus, tracing the timestamps with my eyes, but it did not. I finished, and he gave a small nod, not surprised, not impressed, just confirming that I was following, and because it did not, he continued, everything that depended on that transition is now adjusting in real time. I felt that again, that sense of movement beneath stillness, like something unseen was shifting around me, recalculating, adapting, and I was standing in the middle of it without fully understanding the scale. So they are watching for the gap, I said, more to myself than to him, because it made sense. If I could see it, then someone else could too, someone with more context, more reach, and that was when he looked at me differently, not sharply, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet recognition. Yes, he said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it confirmed what I had been trying not to think about. This was not contained, not entirely, there were other eyes, other perspectives, other people who could see the same disruption I had accidentally caused. I straightened slightly, my thoughts shifting again, becoming more structured, more deliberate. Then staying here does not just isolate me, I said slowly, connecting the pieces as I spoke, it removes me from their line of sight. Adrian did not respond immediately, and that pause told me I was close, close enough that the next part mattered. It limits what they can confirm, he added, and there it was, the missing piece, not just protection, not just control, but uncertainty. He was not just keeping me safe, he was keeping others unsure, and that uncertainty was part of the system too, part of how it stabilized itself without fully resetting. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that settle into place, because it meant I was not just a variable being contained, I was also a factor being concealed, and that changed how I saw everything, including him. You are not just protecting me, I said, turning to face him fully again, you are using me. The words were not accusatory, not emotional, just clear, because clarity was the only thing that seemed to matter here now, and for the first time. He did not deflect it, did not reframe it, he held my gaze and nodded once. Yes, he said, and the honesty of it was disarming in a way I had not expected, because it removed any illusion I could hide behind. This was not about kindness, not about obligation, it was about function, about placement, about decisions made with full awareness of their impact, and yet, despite that, I did not step back, I did not shut down, because understanding it made it easier to stand in it. Not comfortable, not safe, but clear. Then teach me properly, I said, the words coming out before I could second-guess them, and this time, there was a pause, longer than before, not hesitation, but something closer to consideration, like he had not expected that response, not fully, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. You learn fast, he said, and there was something in it, not praise, not approval, but acknowledgement again. And I realized then that this was not just about me adapting to his world, it was also about him adjusting to the fact that I was not going to stay passive inside it. I turned back to the screen, focusing again, because this was where I had leverage now, not power, not control, but understanding, and that was enough to start changing how I moved within this space, even if the boundaries were still his. Then keep going, I said, more grounded now than I had been since this started, because if I was going to be here, if I was going to exist inside something this structured, this controlled, then I was not going to remain blind inside it, and for the first time, it did not feel like I was just being pulled into his world. It felt like I was stepping into it on purpose. The moment I said it, something settled into place that had not been there before, not comfort, not safety, but direction, and that was enough to keep me moving. Adrian did not hesitate again, as if that single decision from me had removed whatever restraint he had been holding back. He adjusted the screen once more, expanding the sequence, revealing layers I had not seen before, connections that did not sit on the surface but threaded underneath everything else, subtle, precise, deliberate. Watch how it compensates, he said, his voice steady, guiding but not simplifying, and I leaned in slightly, following the movement, forcing myself to stay focused, to ignore the weight of everything else and concentrate on the structure itself, because that was where the answers were. When one position shifts, he continued, another absorbs the pressure. I saw it then, not immediately, but gradually. Like an image coming into focus, one line thinning, another strengthening, the balance adjusting without collapsing, and I felt something click in my mind, something familiar, something I recognized from a completely different world. It is like rerouting, I said, the words forming before I could stop them, like when a system redirects traffic to avoid overload. He glanced at me briefly, not surprised, not dismissive, just acknowledging the connection. Yes, he said, and that simple confirmation carried weight again, because it meant I was not just following, I was interpreting. I straightened slightly, my thoughts aligning faster now, more confidently. But rerouting creates patterns, I added, my voice more certain, because I could see it, the repetition, the subtle loops that formed when adjustments happened too quickly. And patterns can be tracked. He did not respond immediately, and that pause felt different this time, not corrective, not evaluative, but something closer to approval. Even if he did not say it out loud. Exactly, he said after a moment, and there it was, the shift, small but undeniable. I was no longer just being shown, I was contributing, even if only slightly, even if it did not change the outcome. It changed my position within it. I looked back at the screen, my focus sharper now, more intentional. So they will not just look for the gap, I said slowly, piecing it together as I spoke. They will look for the pattern the gap creates, and as soon as I said it, I knew it was right, not because he confirmed it, but because it fit, because it aligned with everything else I was starting to understand about this system, about how it moved, how it adapted. And if they find it, I continued, my voice quieter now, because the implication was clear, they find me. The words hung there for a second, heavier than anything else we had said, because this was no longer abstract, no longer theoretical, this was direct, personal, and Adrian did not soften it, did not reframe it. He simply nodded once. Yes, he said, and that confirmation landed deeper than I expected, not as fear, but as clarity, because now I understood exactly what I was standing inside, not just a structure, not just a system, but something that responded to attention, something that could trace disruption back to its source, and I was that source, I let out a slow breath, steadying myself again, because reacting would not help, not here, not now. Then hiding me is not enough, I said, my voice more controlled than I felt. You have to control the pattern too. This time, he did not pause, did not evaluate, he answered immediately, that is what I am doing, and the certainty in his voice was absolute, not defensive, not reassuring, just fact, and for the first time, I saw the scale of it, not just what I had stepped into, but what he was already managing around me, layers upon layers of adjustment, calculation, containment, all moving at once, all without visible strain, and that realization shifted something else inside me, something quieter, but just as important, respect, not admiration, not trust, but recognition of capability, because whatever this world was, he understood it completely, and right now, I did not. I crossed my arms again, but this time it was not defensive, it was grounding, anchoring myself inside a reality that was still forming around me. Then what is my role in that? I asked, because that was the only piece still undefined, not where I was, not why I was here, but what I was supposed to do within it, and Adrian looked at me, directly, fully, like he had been waiting for that question, like everything up to this point had been leading to it. You help me see what I might miss, he said, and the answer caught me off guard, not because it was complicated, but because it was not. It was simple, direct, and unexpectedly equal, not control, not containment, but perspective. And for a second, I did not respond, because that was not what I expected him to say, not what I had prepared for. You said it yourself, he added, his voice steady, deliberate. Patterns can be tracked. I held his gaze, something steady forming in my chest now, not comfort, not certainty, but something close, something that felt like purpose, even if it was still surrounded by risk. And I realized then that this was no longer just about surviving his world, it was about understanding it well enough to move within it without breaking it further, and that meant one thing I had not considered before. I was not just being kept here anymore, I was being used to shape what happened next. For a moment, I did not answer, not because I did not understand what he said, but because I did, and that made it heavier than anything else so far. Helping him meant stepping further in, not just observing, not just learning, but participating in something that had already proven it could shift entire outcomes without warning. I looked back at the screen, at the pattern still moving, still adjusting in ways that felt both controlled and unpredictable, and I realized something I had not fully accepted until now. There was no version of this where I stayed untouched, not anymore. You trust me to see what you might miss, I said slowly, testing the weight of that idea, and Adrian did not hesitate, did not soften it. I trust your perspective, he corrected, and that distinction mattered, because it was not about belief, it was about function again, about how I fit into something larger. I let out a quiet breath, grounding myself in that clarity, because if I was going to do this, I needed to understand exactly where I stood. Then show me what you are not seeing, I said, my voice steady now, more certain than it had been at any point since this began, and for the first time, there was a pause from him that felt different, not evaluative, not cautious, but deliberate, like he was deciding to give me access to something deeper. He adjusted the display again, but this time the data shifted in a way that was less structured, less obvious, fragments instead of sequences, gaps instead of lines, and I frowned slightly, leaning closer, because this was harder to read, harder to follow. This is where it becomes unclear, he said, and I could hear it now, the difference in his tone, not uncertainty, but complexity, something that required more than precision to navigate. I studied the screen, forcing myself to slow down again, to not look for the same patterns I had just learned, because this was different. This was not about clean transitions or visible disruptions. This was about absence, about what was not there. There is no direct link, I said after a moment, my voice quieter, more focused, but something is still moving. He nodded once, watching me closely now, not the screen, but me, like my reaction mattered more than the data itself. Yes, he said, and I felt it again, that shift, that subtle change in how he was engaging with me, less instruction, more observation, like I had crossed into a space where my input was no longer just expected, it was necessary. I traced one of the fragments with my eyes, following its movement, its timing, its subtle alignment with something else that did not immediately connect, and then I saw it, not clearly, not perfectly, but enough to recognize it. It is not following the pattern I Said, more to myself than to him, it is avoiding it. The word settled into the space between us, and I felt something click again, deeper this time, sharper, because this was not just adjustment, this was intention. Explain, Adrian said, his voice lower now, more focused, and I could feel the weight of that single word, not a command, but an expectation. I straightened slightly, organizing my thoughts as I spoke. If they were just reacting, they would reinforce the existing pattern, I said, gesturing lightly toward the screen, but this is different, it moves around it, not through it. I paused for a second, letting the idea settle, making sure I was not rushing ahead of myself, which means they are not just tracking the disruption. I continued, my voice steadier now, more certain, they are anticipating how it will be contained. The silence that followed was different, heavier, more focused, and when I looked at him, really looked, I saw it, the shift I had not seen before, not in control, not in composure, but in attention, like something I said had landed exactly where it needed to. And if they anticipate that, I added, quieter now, because the implication was clear, then staying here might not be enough. Adrian did not respond immediately, and that pause stretched longer than any before it, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but calculation, real time, visible in the stillness of his posture, the focus in his eyes. And for the first time since this began, I realized something that changed everything again. I was not just learning from him anymore, he was adjusting because of me. Then we changed the pattern, he said finally, and the words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not, because this was no longer just about reacting to what had already happened, it was about shaping what came next. And I felt it then, that shift from passive to active, from contained to involved. I asked, not challenging, not questioning, just confirming, and he held my gaze, steady, certain, like there was no other answer. Yes, he said, and for the first time, it did not feel like I was being pulled into something I did not choose. It felt like I had already stepped in, and now I had a role in where it went. The word we did not echo, it settled, quiet but permanent, like something that had already taken root before either of us said it out loud, and I felt the weight of that shift more than anything else so far, not because it changed the situation, but because it changed my position inside it. I was no longer just reacting to his decisions, I was now part of them, and that realization did not feel empowering, it felt precise. Like stepping onto a line that did not allow hesitation. I looked back at the screen, forcing myself to focus, because if this was going to work, if I was going to help shape what came next, then I could not afford to stay overwhelmed by the scale of it. If we change the pattern, I said slowly, organizing the thought as I spoke, then we need to give them something else to follow. Adrian did not respond immediately, but I could feel his attention sharpen, not on the data, but on me, waiting, evaluating, not just hide the disruption. I continued, my voice steadier now, replace it. The word felt right as soon as I said it, not erase, not conceal, but redirect, and I saw it then, the smallest shift in his expression, not surprise, not approval, something closer to alignment, like the idea had landed exactly where it needed to. Go on, he said, and there was no hesitation in his tone now, no distance, just focus. I leaned slightly closer to the screen, tracing the fragments again, but this time with a different intent, not just understanding what was there, but imagining what could be inserted in its place. If they are anticipating containment, I said, then they expect a predictable response. I paused for a second, letting the logic settle, making sure I was not rushing ahead. So we give them that, I added, quieter now, more deliberate, but not the real one. The silence that followed was heavier, more concentrated, and I could feel it. The shift from explanation to strategy, from observation to action. Adrian moved closer to the table again, his hand resting lightly against the edge, his gaze fixed on the screen, but I knew he was listening to every word, measuring it, testing it against everything else he already knew. You want to create a decoy pattern, he said, not questioning, not dismissing, just defining it, and I nodded once, because that was exactly what it was. Something clean, I said, something that looks like a natural correction, something they recognize. I glanced at him briefly, then back at the screen, because the idea was forming faster now, clearer, sharper, but it leads them away from the actual adjustment. He did not interrupt, did not challenge it, and that told me enough. I was not overstepping, I was inside the process now, whether I had intended to be or not, "And where does that leave you?" he asked, and the question was direct, precise, cutting straight to the part one had not fully addressed yet. I held his gaze for a second before answering, because this part mattered, this part defined everything else. "Inside the real pattern," I said. And I could hear it in my own voice now, the certainty that had not been there before, not confidence, but clarity, because I understood the trade now, visibility for misdirection, risk for control, hidden by something they think they already understand. The word settled between us, and this time, there was no pause, no recalibration. Adrian nodded once, decisive, like the plan had already been accepted, already moving into place. "Then we build it," he said. And the simplicity of that response carried more weight than anything else, because it meant we were no longer discussing possibilities, we were defining outcomes. I turned back to the screen, my focus narrowing again, because now it was not just about understanding the system, it was about shaping it, carefully, precisely, without breaking it further, and I realized something then, something that shifted everything again. I was no longer just trying to survive his world, I was actively participating in how it moved, how it adapted, how it responded, and that meant one thing I had not fully accepted. Until now, there was no clean line between his world and mine anymore, because somewhere along the way, they had already merged, and I was standing right at the center of it. The moment he said it, everything moved faster, not visibly, not in a way anyone outside this room would notice, but I felt it, the shift from theory to execution, from understanding to consequence. Adrian did not waste time explaining what came next, he acted, his hand moving across the screen with precision, isolating segments, reassigning positions, adjusting sequences in a way that looked effortless but carried weight. I was only beginning to understand, and I realized something then. This was what he did, not just control outcomes, but shape the invisible structures that led to them. "Watch closely," he said, his voice lower now, more focused, and I leaned in without thinking, because this was the part where mistakes mattered, where even a small misstep could ripple outward in ways I could not predict. The screen shifted again, the fragmented areas I had identified now being reconnected, but not to their original paths, to new ones, carefully constructed, deliberately familiar. "You build it like it belongs," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, because I could see it now, the logic behind the decoy. It was not random, not forced, it followed the same rules as everything else, the same structure, the same rhythm, just redirected. "If it feels artificial, they will question it," Adrian replied, not looking at me, his attention fully on the adjustments he was making. "So it has to feel inevitable." The word settled into me, inevitable, not obvious, not perfect, but expected, and I felt something sharpen in my understanding. This was not about hiding the truth, it was about replacing it with something more believable. I traced the new sequence with my eyes, following the flow, checking for breaks, inconsistencies, anything that might stand out, and for a moment, I saw nothing. It was seamless, almost too seamless. "There," I said suddenly, pointing to a slight overlap in timing, barely noticeable, but enough to create a subtle tension in the pattern. Adrian paused, just for a fraction of a second, then adjusted it without hesitation, smoothing it out in a way that made it disappear completely. "Good," he said, and this time, the word landed differently, not acknowledgement, not approval, but integration, like my input had already been absorbed into the system, becoming part of the outcome without disrupting it. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself again, because this was no longer abstract, no longer something I could observe from a distance. I was inside it now, contributing to something that would exist beyond this room, beyond this moment. "Once they follow this," I said, my voice steady but quieter now, "they stop looking for the real shift." Adrian nodded once, finishing the final adjustment, the screen settling into a new configuration that looked complete, stable, unremarkable. "They follow what makes sense," he said, and there was something in his tone now, something deeper, like he was not just talking about the system, but about people, about how easily perception could be guided if the structure supported it. I looked at the screen one last time, committing it to memory, because I knew it mattered, not just the pattern itself, but the logic behind it, the way it was built, the way it functioned, and the real pattern. I asked, because that part still existed, still moved underneath everything else, and Adrian turned to me fully this time, his expression steady, but there was something else there now, something I had not seen before, not control, not calculation, something closer to intent, stays with us, he said, and the weight of that settled into my chest, because it meant the truth was no longer just something I had stumbled into. It was something I was now responsible for holding, protecting in a way I had never considered before. The room fell quiet again after that, not tense, not uncertain, but complete, like something had been set in motion that could not be undone, and I felt it then, not fear, not doubt, but something sharper, something more defined. I had crossed into this world by accident, but I was no longer here by chance. I was here because I had chosen to understand it, to step into it fully. And that meant one thing I could no longer ignore: whatever happened next, I was part of it, not on the outside, not looking in, but at the center, where the patterns were made. The screen dimmed slightly as the system locked the changes in place, not with a sound, not with a signal, but with a quiet finality that I felt more than I saw, like something invisible had just settled into alignment, and for the first time since this started, nothing moved, not the patterns, not the sequences, not even the tension in the air. Everything held, steady, controlled, complete. I stepped back slowly, my eyes still on the screen, tracing the structure one last time, looking for flaws, for anything that might unravel what we had just built, but there was nothing, not because it was perfect, but because it made sense, and in this world, that was enough. They will follow it, I said quietly, more to myself than to him, and Adrian did not correct me, did not add anything, which meant he agreed, which meant it was done. I let out a slow breath I did not realize I had been holding, the weight in my chest shifting, not disappearing, but changing, settling into something more stable, more defined, and when I finally looked away from the screen, my attention returning to the room, to him, everything felt different, not safer, not easier, but clearer, like the uncertainty had been replaced with something sharper, something I could work with. So this is it, I said, turning fully toward him, because that was what it felt like, a line crossed, a moment that separated everything before from everything after. Adrian held my gaze, steady as always, but there was something else there now, something I had not seen when this began, not distance, not control, something closer to recognition, like he no longer saw me as someone outside the structure, but as part of it. This is the beginning, he said, and the way he said it carried more weight than anything else, because it was not an ending, not a resolution, it was an entry point. I felt that settle into me, deep, undeniable, because it meant this was not over, not even close. This was just the moment everything started to take shape. I glanced back at the city through the glass, the lights still stretching endlessly, unchanged, unaware, and for a second, I thought about what my life had looked like just hours ago, simple, structured, predictable, in ways I had never questioned, and it felt distant now, not gone, but out of reach, like something I could remember but not return to the same way. And me? I asked, because even with everything that had happened, that question still mattered, still defined where I stood. Adrian did not hesitate, did not look away. You stay, he said, and the simplicity of it hit harder than anything else, because it was not a request, not a suggestion, just a fact, already decided, already in motion. I should have resisted, should have pushed back again, should have held on to whatever part of me still belonged to the world outside this room, but I did not, not because I agreed, but because I understood what leaving meant now, understood what staying allowed, and more than that, I understood myself differently. I was not just reacting anymore, I was choosing to remain where I could see, where I could learn, where I could influence what happened next, even if that influence was small, even if it came with a cost I had not fully measured yet. I crossed my arms lightly. Not defensive, not closed off, just grounded, holding my place in a reality that had already shifted around me. Then I stay, I said, my voice steady, clear, and for the first time, it felt like my decision, not just his, even if the outcome had always been the same. Adrian watched me for a moment, longer than before, and then he nodded once, not approving, not commanding, just accepting, like something had aligned exactly as it was meant to, and the room fell quiet again, not empty, not uncertain, but full of something new, something that did not need to be said out loud. I turned back to the screen one last time, the patterns now stable, controlled, hidden in plain sight, and I realized something that stayed with me even as the moment passed, even as everything moved forward into whatever came next. He could control the system, he could shape the outcome, but tonight, I had changed the way he saw it, and that meant one thing I would not forget. He did not just keep me close because I was at risk, he kept me close because I mattered, and in his world, that was more dangerous than anything else.